Hello, welcome to Deviance and Social Control. Today, we're going to talk about the diversity of deviance, or what is sometimes affectionately known as nuts, sluts, and perverts. Many classes on deviance and social control focus almost exclusively on different types of deviant behavior. So we're going to go over a few of the very common areas of deviance today. We're going to start first with physical deviance and appearance. So physical deviance is perhaps the most visible form of deviance. It's something that we wear on our skin. It's visible to other people. This kind of physical deviance can evoke stereotypes, stigma, and discrimination. Stigma you may not have heard of. Stigma is a mark of deviance or disgrace. It's a negative label, and this kind of negative label or perceived deviance often leads to stigma that can then reduce an individual's life chances. So if you are stigmatized, if you have a label that is deviant, people may treat you differently, and you may not have access to the kinds of things that people who don't have such a stigma might have. So there are different types of physical deviance. Overall, we're talking about one is violations of aesthetic norms. So what people should look like in a particular culture. And this includes height, weight, or the absence or presence of disfigurement. So these kind of aesthetic norms, violating aesthetic norms can be a type of physical deviance. Or physical incapacity. So this could include people with a physical disability, something that is, again, worn on their body. That is considered a type of physical deviance in this world of deviance and social control. Physical deviance often acts as a marker. So for example, passersby may notice people with lots of tattoos, or heavily muscled female bodybuilders, or those with physical disabilities. And when they notice these characteristics, they may imbue them, the people, with other characteristics about that physical marker. So we may assume that people with lots of visible tattoos act in a particular way. Oftentimes, the stereotype is about heavily tattooed people and engaging in other subcultural deviance, or even being criminal, for example. The idea behind physical deviance has a lot to do with what is acceptable or what is desirable. Now, our ideas of what is acceptable or desire in terms of physical appearance vary widely. It really depends on the social context. What we consider beautiful in one culture, another culture may consider quite unattractive, and vice versa. And sometimes the physical standards of beauty are really unattainable. So, along with professionally styled hair and makeup and the use of meticulous lighting and camera angles, editors in magazines, movies, films can now touch up photographs or remove wrinkles and traces of cellulite and make what are already beautiful models seem even more thin. So all their thin wrists and waists and everything sort of more defined. Let's look at a quick video clip about this. So that quick video shows you kind of the unrealistic standards, especially that the media can set about beauty, standards that people can't reach, which probably wouldn't be that big of a deal, except that setting those kind of truly unattainable standards for the ideal of physical beauty can lead to a lot of other deviant behavior. It can include harmful eating disorders like anorexia nervosa or bulimia. It can include unnecessary plastic surgeries. So this type of deviant behavior is something that we can all end up being subject to, because the standard of acceptable beauty is so unattainable. It can be often out of reach for most people. So let's move on to another fun topic. Students often love this one: body modification. So when we're talking about body modification, these are piercings or scarification, extreme tattooing, reconstructive and cosmetic surgery. In the extreme for all of these, to have a big physical marker for body modification. So, and the reasons for body modification are really varied. Lots of people engage in some of these really extreme body modifications, but more than 3,500 people have joined what's called the Church of Body Modification. And they view their physical changes as a way to spiritually strengthen the connection between their mind, body, and soul. But let's look at a few examples. The most heavily tattooed people in the world are often referred to just by their image, by the images of their tattoos. So for example, we have Catman, who has tattoos all over his body in the form of a cat, or Zombie Boy, who is actually a model, but all the tattoos make him look like a zombie, like a skeleton or a dead person. There is Red Skull, who modified his appearance to look like the the Marvel character Red Skull, going so far as to actually cut off his own nose. Or the Lizard Man, who cut his own tongue so that he would have a forked tongue like a lizard, and then is also covered in all kinds of other tattoos. So that's body modification. It can be often a big deal, and people, it's so visible, and it creates a lot of stigma because people are so visibly marked by these kinds of body modifications. It causes people to interact with them differently. Let's move on to another kind of deviance in relationships. So first, sexually unconventional behavior. You know, people in society, all of us, are often really intrigued by others' intimate relationships and sexual practices for a variety of reasons. As we talk about these, remember that as with virtually any kind of deviance, sexual deviance is largely determined by the community, by culture, and by context. So we'll mention some things that are commonly thought of as deviant behavior, but remember, it's not universal. There are plenty of cultures and plenty of people, even in the US, who don't think of these behaviors that we're going to discuss as deviant or otherwise unconventional. But in this realm of sexually unconventional behavior, we have things like exotic dancers or strippers, sex tourism, anonymous sex in public restrooms, polyamory, which is having multiple sexual partners, online sexual predators, prostitutes, premarital chastity, many other behaviors that many people consider out of the norm of sexually conventional behavior. But it's important to remember that even within the United States, there is considerable disagreement about what sexual activities should and should not be allowed. And this changes even over time within the same culture. So for example, the issue of same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage has had a long and interesting history in the US. And this example, community values were quite recently tested and defined on political ballots across the country, where people in many states were voting to either legalize or make illegal same-sex marriage. The US is not atypical in this regard. Many countries around the world also find same-sex marriages to be part of deviant behavior, but many cultures around the world find same-sex marriage to be completely common and absolutely among normal behavior. So this is one of those examples where Some people might consider it deviant, other people might not consider it deviant. Another example is prostitution. So most of the places in the US consider prostitution a crime. In many parts of Nevada, it is legal. And in other parts of the world, it is also legal. In Amsterdam, prostitution is legal. It's highly regulated. And the sex workers are regularly have health screenings and insurance. So there's a wide variety of opinions about prostitution. There's even movements in the United States to try to legalize prostitution, or at least to decriminalize prostitution. While societal norms shape our conceptions of appropriate sexual boundary, those boundaries are regularly tested by new fads and businesses, and by many different subcultures that make up their own rules about sexual propriety. And subcultures are distinct groups within the larger culture that has its own set of norms, values, behaviors, or characteristics. So, for example, the polyamory subculture, there are rules about how to engage with sexual partners, with multiple romantic partners, rules that the dominant culture may not understand or may not know. But the rules within the subculture normalize some behaviors that the dominant culture might find atypical and deviant, and then stigmatize behaviors that maybe the dominant culture find completely normal and not deviant. Okay, quickly on to cyberdeviance. Now, cyberdeviance is a relatively new phenomenon, but it already has many different forms, and it has a potentially huge impact on daily lives. Many of us are highly involved with the internet and with all kinds of cyber communications. And so the discussion of deviance is kind of exciting, but we don't actually know all of the rules in cyberspace yet. So we're kind of making up these norms as we go. As we see a new behavior, we learn whether or not we want that to be typical or atypical. As Adler and Adler say, the cyber world represents a new form of space that is both out there and in here, simultaneously public and social, while remaining private and solitary. These spaces are fertile locations for the rise of virtual communities that challenge traditional notions of identity and community, and can radically alter our conceptions of community and the nature of our communities. So what counts in this cyber deviance? There are things that you might think about: hacking, phishing, cyber terrorism, which causes lots of problems for people in a variety of ways. It can also be the kind of misinformation and election tampering that we saw in the US election the last couple of cycles. But there's just a variety of other things that would probably be considered deviant in the cyber space: online pedophile subcultures, cyberbullying, online dishonesty and cheating by students, sexting, illegal downloads of like movies, music, readings, those kinds of things. But like I said, that we're still kind of figuring out what the rules of cyberspace are. Some of these rules have gotten made into laws that it's illegal to do some things than others, like downloading illegal music, even though it's quite common. Other things we're still kind of figuring out how to deal with it. Things like cyberbullying. What do you do about cyberbullying, for example? Okay, let's go on to elite deviance or corporate deviance, other kinds of workplace misconduct. This is an area that students don't often think about, this kind of elite deviance, because it's not really on our radar a lot. So elite deviants are criminal and deviant acts that are committed by large corporations, by powerful political organizations, or by individuals with prestige and influence, so that are considered elite. Many of us tend to fear being victimized by street crimes, but we probably don't really think about the enormous impact that this kind of elite deviance has on our everyday lives. So some examples. David Simon distinguishes several different types of harm: physical harms, financial harms, and moral harms in this elite deviance realm. So the physical harms can include death or physical injury. So these can be laws that sentence people to death, These can be other types of war crimes or incarceration or things that are determined by the elites and that affect non-elites primarily. There are financial harms, which can include robbery, or in the elite realm, it might be embezzlement, other kinds of fraud and various scams that have to do with financial harms to individuals. And then moral harms. Now, moral harms are harder to define, but it's generally the kinds of behaviors that encourage distrust and alienation, primarily among the lower and middle classes. Simon also talks about 3 types of elite deviant acts. So he talks about economic domination, government and governmental control, and the denial of basic human rights. Economic domination includes things like monopolies, price fixing, price gouging, misleading advertising. It's things in the economic sphere that really control our lives. So monopolies prevent us from getting good prices on things because organizations band together. Price fixing, when organizations talk to each other about setting a certain price for something, so that even if there is competition, we still don't get a lower price. Price gouging is just charging exorbitantly higher prices for things than they need to be. And then other types of economic domination, including misleading advertising. So some would argue that the fact that pharmaceutical corporations in the US, the fact that they can advertise their company is part of this economic domination, because it encourages people to think more about buying certain types of medicines, talking to their doctors about needing this medicine when they may not even necessarily need that medicine at all. But other kinds of misleading advertisements that encourage people to buy things that they don't need, or to buy things that actually are harmful to them. These are other things that can be considered part of that economic domination. Government and governmental control is a little harder for some people to understand, but broadly, you can think about things like bribery or extortion or kickbacks among the government, particularly when it comes to government contracts. So the kind of hoops that people jump through, defrauding the government to get a government contract. But it's also the actions of the government. So lying and misleading the public, creating laws that disadvantage some groups more than others. All of these really are about can create a sense of distrust in the government, feeling like the government isn't out to protect the citizens of the nation. Some of that is actually related to the denial of basic human rights. Well, so it's largely the result of government policies, but when governments don't set a livable minimum wage, when there is inadequate housing or low quality education, unsafe work conditions, or lack of adequate health care, all of these things the United Nations anyway have designated as basic human rights. And many governments, including the US, don't enable their citizens to have some of these basic human rights. So in this sense of elite deviance, many of us would be affected by a lot of these types of elite deviance, and we don't really recognize it because it's so taken for granted, because the deviance is committed by the powerful, the ones who make the laws. So that's it. It was a very quick tour of the nuts, sluts, and perverts, the hit parade of the deviant carnival. And we will start talking about some theoretical reasons for all of these kinds of deviance in future weeks.